Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 31 of Logicast, the AWS News Podcast brought to you by Logicata. I'm Carl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined today, as always, by self-proclaimed part of the furniture, karate expert and Japanese electoral politics aficionado, lead cloud engineer, John Goodall. How are you doing today, John?
That's the longest introduction in history. That's
Well, you keep
expert
adding
is a
stuff
bit
to your text.
expert is a bit rich, let's be honest. I have my first proper grading in about 3 weeks, and I'm training so hard I now need to do physiotherapy.
My father always told me that an X was a has-been and a spurt is a drip under pressure. So maybe it wasn't a compliment. But on that note, I think I ought to introduce our guest for today. Second time guest, in fact, Warren Parad, CTO of Authorus. How are you doing today, Warren?
Thanks for having me back, Carl. I think it's been almost exactly a year since I was on your podcast last time.
Wow, time flies when you're having fun. I think we've probably done 40, 41 episodes in that time frame. What have you been up to in that time frame?
I guess it became one of the official hosts of the Adventures in DevOps podcast, and we've been struggling to make that a reality. So I know how you guys have spent a lot of time automating lots of stuff in your podcast, and we started to go down that path too.
Cool. How many episodes have you guys recorded now?
I think for the podcast, it's over 250. I think we just passed that number not too long ago. And still looking for new guests. Actually, we're giving out credits for people who make good recommendations for guests for our show.
What credits?
If I recommend
AWS
myself,
credits?
can I get the credits?
You could potentially be a guest if you have an interesting topic that is DevOps related, highly technical, and can talk to our audience. So I would absolutely give credits to people who self-select. No problem.
So Japanese electoral politics is not a topic for discussion on your podcast.
It wouldn't have been, but if John shows up, then I guess it may have to be.
He may just drag you down that rabbit hole.
It was
But it was a
one
good
passing
one.
comment.
It was a good one. You know, how on earth we got to Japanese electoral politics on an AWS News podcast will always baffle me. Definitely stood out that one comment. Warren, for listeners that didn't hear the episode you recorded with us a year ago, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Authorus, etc.
I run technology at a small SaaS company, and what we do is we generate JWTs for the applications that our customers write. So login and access control for mostly B2B. And the more complicated the stack is, the better a fit it is for our product. That's what I do. I think most of the time I write blog posts and speak at conferences and don't do anything tech related. That just comes with the job at this level, but it's still fun. I still enjoy it.
Living the
That
dream.
sounds like John's. Yeah, he's going to say it sounds like John's ideal job. That's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to touch the tech.
No, keep me the hell away from production workloads. Good grief.
Yeah. You're at lead level now, so you're on the way. Maybe one day we'll get you AFK permanently, or just using the keyboard to write blog posts like Warren does, and not Terraform code. Yeah. Anyway, as regular listeners to the podcast will know, we occasionally talk about Japanese electoral politics and karate, but that's not the main topic for the podcast. We are an AWS news podcast, and once a week I curate a list of AWS news that I share via my weekly AWS News Roundup newsletter, and then John selects a subset of those articles that we'd like to talk about with our guests. So we have, of course, shared some articles with Warren ahead of the weekend, and of course he's read them all from beginning to end, not summarized them with AI like I do. Ooh, shouldn't have said that, but anyway, we have got a selection of articles. The first of those is an article from the AWS security blog, all about how you can automatically disable users in AWS managed Microsoft Active Directory based on GuardDuty findings. So if you're unfortunate enough to be using Active Directory, which I think a huge proportion of the world is, or Entra ID as it's now known. This is a current blog post. It probably should say Entra ID, really, shouldn't it? Rather than, but yeah. Thoughts on that, John?
Isn't Entra ID the Azure Active Directory?
I think it's all of it now.
If
So
it's AWS
if it's an
managed,
on-prem,
still-
yeah.
I think the goal was that they could increase the amount of time that you spend thinking about Microsoft products by continually changing the name and confusing people. So what is actually happening here is AWS offers a managed version of Active Directory, still called Microsoft Active Directory, that gets deployed and can be used to integrate with domain controllers. And you can run that inside AWS. So I don't think that's part of Entra technically. It doesn't really handle the authentication side at all.
Yeah. Okay, but this is a security post about how you can actually disable users in AWS managed Microsoft Active Directory based on GuardDuty findings. So, yeah, thoughts on why you might want to do that?
This thing is a beast, honestly. Yeah, it's quite challenging to get up and running. If you go and deploy the AWS Managed Active Directory to your AWS account, you may spend an hour or more waiting for it just to get deployed. And it doesn't come with its own API. The only way to integrate with it is to deploy an EC2 machine that has the domain controller on it and interact with it through there. There's no UI, there's no API, so you need to do a lot of complicated things to make it happen. The blog post basically just goes over the Rube Goldberg machine that you have to set up in order to even communicate with it. And I think this is if you're in this unfortunate state, I don't know why you just wouldn't transition to using Azure and run your AD there. And then you can just deploy a event bridge plus Lambda function. So if a user gets compromised or an EC2 machine that's logging in as a user gets compromised, you would fire off event bridge and then just use a Lambda function to terminate the access for that user. But if you decided to use AWS Managed Active Directory service, then good luck.
We all know that Amazon abhors the idea that anyone else could earn money. So that's probably why. The concept that someone else might have some of your business, just they don't quite understand that as a concept. So here's a thing that someone else made, but you don't want to pay them to use it. You want to pay us to use it, and then we'll make it harder to work with. Cool. But yeah, the Rube Goldberg machine is a perfect idiom for this. It's for the uninitiated, because I don't know how old our listeners are. That's one of those machines that you probably have seen on TikTok, where they have these ridiculous contraptions that marbles run, hammers hit things, and it's all just to, I don't know, make a piece of toast or wake a guy up in the morning or something. You've probably seen them on TikTok for all the Gen Zs listening, or Gen Alphas, or whatever they are. Yeah, this is an interesting one, though. As you say, this is one of those, use the other thing that has an API, but if you are stuck with this because, I don't know, your CISO's a dinosaur or something, it's quite interesting, and it belies other things that you can do as well. So this example is, it's not contrived. I'm sure it exists and there's reasons for it, but GuardDuty finds a thing being suspicious, and then you need to do a thing on a server about that. That's not an uncommon design pattern. This particular example is a little bit weird, but it's not an uncommon design pattern that I've got a thing going wrong on an server. I need to do something about it on an server. How am I going to do that? Event bridge, and then step functions, and then systems manager, which in turn uses the SSM run command to do things against the box. That's not that unusual. That's quite interesting.
I think the unusual part is that you're not actually doing anything against the box here. You need the box to communicate with Active Directory, the managed service. It's irrelevant of what you do, because it's the only way to actually communicate with it. And the only way to communicate with the EC2 machine is to use Systems Manager. And the only way to communicate with that is by running a command somewhere. And so you definitely have this whole stacked up. If you're not using the Active Directory managed service, then almost all of this architecture goes away. So yeah, if you're stuck in this situation, then unfortunately you need this whole mess just to make it happen.
Yeah, it is a Rube Goldberg machine. It really
Cool.
is.
So for our older generation, I was just going to say, for the older generation listeners who don't know about Rube Goldberg machines, think about Heath Robinson. That's probably way too old a reference for anybody listening to this podcast. But if you Google Heath Robinson, you'll find some amazing old drawings by an English artist of similar things. Anyway, we're not related, by the way, me and Heath, although if you'd seen some of my DIY, you might think we were. Anyway, on that note, let's move along to our second article for this week. And it is, of course, about AI. At least it's on the AWS Artificial Intelligence blog anyway. And this is all about how you can build modern serverless solutions following best practices using Amazon Q Developer CLI. I think we've spoken about MCP every week now for the last... Yeah, what are your thoughts on this one, John? Were you excited about this?
No, I picked it because it had serverless and MCP in it. Nothing about this excites me. I don't even understand what MCP is at this point. I'm scared to ask.
Well, maybe I can chime in here then. It's people who use LLMs never saw an API before and are now getting excited about REST and OAuth related stuff and communication and RCP or RPC. And this is just exactly the same as REST APIs and gRPC, except done way worse. That's all it is, realistically. It's a way to define what your agent can do in a spec. And what we do in REST services is use Open API specification to actually say what goes on there. The argument goes that what is human readable in the documentation for communicating with an API is too complicated. It's not optimized. And the solution there is to make a better API docs. But instead of doing that, they said, hey, what if we just make a different API doc, call it MCP? And this is how an LLM can understand what that server can actually do, or what that API can actually do. The thing about blog posts in AWS that I try to caution people is just because there's a blog post that exists doesn't mean that you should actually do what it says. This one's interesting because it's actually by the AWS team to talk about what QDeveloper can do. And QDeveloper is just the few letters they put in front of every single service to proclaim that AI exists in AWS. And the interesting thing is that all it does is it adds plugins to QDeveloper to do serverless-like things that it didn't know how to do before. And unfortunately, even in the examples in this blog post, they aren't good recommendations. If you ask for a serverless solution, the CloudFormation or the SAM template that it'll generate actually includes an ALB and a legacy API gateway, REST API. It's not even the best way to solve those problems. It's like a real joke that they're saying you can follow best practices, and in the output that they've included in the blog post, it's not even the best practice.
That about tracks, doesn't it? That's just vibe code your way to terrible architecture, but we'll call it the best thing. Yeah, not great.
So
Like
is
I
this
say,
upsetting
MCP
your
is beyond
serverless
me.
sensibilities, John?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't know. Like I say, MCP is a bit beyond me. It's one of those things that's come out of left field. It's come out of seemingly nowhere, and I've been too busy doing actual work to pay attention to it. And I don't know. I'm hoping it's a flash in the pan and it'll all go away again because everyone will understand what an API is, or all of this will just get baked into some sort of service and I can consume it without having to worry about deploying my own servers for this.
Yeah, so right now there are data services out there, services that own some data or some actions, and they only offer a REST API or a SOAP API, heaven forbid, that's what they're doing, or a WCF service or whatever Microsoft supports. And what some of the world is saying is, wouldn't it be great if an LLM could easily interact with it? And realistically, the way that they're set up, the answer is not really, without a lot of extra effort. And the companies that own these services aren't interested in making them work better with agents. So other people who aren't part of the company at all are spinning up their own servers or open source for generating servers which can talk to those APIs. So just a proxy, and then offering that as an option. That's pretty much all it is. MCP is like an Nginx proxy for interacting with services and providing the API in just a slightly different format.
Yeah, I'm going to keep ignoring it. We appear to have lost our producer. Oh, are you back?
I think so. I think Carl's back.
He's looking very disinterested. Shall we move on and see if he catches up?
Yeah, what's the third article?
So the next one that we're going to talk about is defense in depth security for code build pipelines, which is an interesting one for me because how much defense in depth security do you need for something that you shouldn't be running in a public workspace? You shouldn't be running publicly anyway, and should be behind security groups and doing all that sort of thing. But maybe that's what it's talking about because I didn't even bother to summarize this one.
So I think what's going on here is you may get pull requests into your Git repository, and those pull requests are going to be from your local team, and you may want to deploy some infrastructure to test that pull request. And when you're going about that, you may be concerned that the software or the code changes that are in that pull request are malicious in nature. And if it's just your internal team, you probably trust it. But what if you are in a public open source world and you want to deploy and run a test against that pull request? Maybe it's from a forked repository or someone who is trying to inject malicious code in. Happened recently to the AWS tools for QDeveloper, and we're not going to get into that.
Oh, no, we will. We will.
But in this case, realistically, you may see a difference on the security level of the code that you want to actually execute. And this just goes through some of those practices of how you decide whether to inject in environment variables, what code should be executed, where that request came from. So in GitHub, it may be a pull request or a comment or a change or an update or which branch is being interacted with. And all that it's doing here is showing you how to filter on those and execute different actions based off of what actually changed in the repository.
Yeah, okay. I can see the value in that. That all seems really interesting. It does talk a little bit about self-hosted runners as an alternative to some of this. And as you say, let's not get into the Q developer thing, but maybe we should, because if only they'd followed their own advice. Like,
I'm waiting for the official rollout of the RCA for what actually happened here because it's not exactly clear. I think there's a lot of conflicting information that has been shared about what exactly got merged, what the exact state was, under what conditions, and what actually made sense. And I know AWS is spending effort to actually answer some of these questions. So when they're ready, I think they will have something that adheres to what the community is actually expecting. And until that time, unfortunately, I think people are just going to speculate as to how bad of an issue it was and what actually happened.
yeah, the problem with that was it wasn't an immediate public, this is a thing and we've rolled forward. It was we've yanked this version, which I understand, but there was very limited public acknowledgement of what actually went on.
I think transparency here. When people are affected, they need to know what happened for sure. You don't have to publicize everything, but you should definitely publicize when there's an incident, when there's an issue. And I think AWS and a lot of the other cloud providers get a lot of slack in their status health dashboards and whatnot that always say that they're green. And I think this is just another flavor of that.
Yeah, it rubs me up the wrong way a bit because I'm often quite defensive of AWS on their security posture because they usually have a really good track record of this and they have a history of going back to the beginning of a service and saying we've got all the logs since we rolled this thing out and
Yeah.
we've looked at all of them. And this one was just we don't think there was a problem. And okay, fair enough. You can't necessarily have the logs for this because this was a plugin that pushed something out. So that kind of analysis is going to be a lot harder, but it just feels really disingenuous.
Yeah, I think this is a good point to remember that AWS as a company is like a lot of little micro companies, realistically, and the ones that are powering AWS proper infrastructure are different than the teams that are potentially running things like building open source solutions or or security in that regard, or in this case, the developer related stuff or open source plugins for VS Code and whatnot. And since they're all different, you can expect a little bit of a different response. Just if you've ever gone to the partner portal in AWS, it's the most atrocious thing you've ever seen in your entire life, I assure you. The login and access control is nuts. The UIs, the UX there is just not great. It's just a whole different level. You can complain about the AWS console all day long, but then if you go to this, you'll maybe be more appreciative of the effort that's actually gone into the console.
Yeah, I make the same comparison. Is there's not and it's not just AWS that suffers from this. I think Amazon suffers from it more than some other companies because of the two pizza team thing. But there's no such thing as a big company. Every big company is 50 small companies that don't like each other wearing a trench coat. But yeah, I think Amazon suffers from that more than a lot because of the whole two pizza small teams thing, which works in some cases and doesn't in others.
Yeah, definitely with you here. Like I said, I would be really interested to read the breakdown of what they think actually went down here and actually happened, and whether or not this changes how they're approaching some of their open source things that some of the teams are releasing things that are branded with the AWS name, and then people have assumptions about how secure or the expectation on the quality of that tool that is being used.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Try explaining to someone that doesn't understand, that's never worked for a large business, doesn't understand how large businesses are strung together, that it's not one business. Yeah, is this all the same? No, it's not, and it will work differently. But try explaining that to someone that's only ever worked for small businesses.
Yeah, I think the large enterprise that you're talking about is also relevant here. Like they all have different internal workings. If we look at GCP and Google, like it is more of a monolith. It is more of a single mindset in a lot of ways. But the one thing that does come out frequently there is it still matters who your manager is or what team you're on in some regard. So while they are more homogeneous in nature compared to, say, AWS, you still end up with similar problems that are not consistency across different teams.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Should we talk back about this article again instead of the internal political structure of AWS? That's a fun tangent.
Yeah, I am confused about this in a little ways though, because if your source code is in GitHub, why would you not use the GitHub action runners that are provided by GitHub, or at the very least using managed runners, which are in the same spot? Like for me, never really understood this part about using CodeBuild in this fashion, because first of all, you can't store your source code in AWS anymore anyway, because code commit is over. And once that's gone, I don't really understand what the fundamental use case is. It used to be the case that if you wanted to run a Lambda function for longer than 15 minutes, CodeBuild was your answer. But now AWS Fargate on ECS supports one-time actions there. So realistically, I don't really see the value doing this, you're adding a lot of complexity to your development pipeline. For what value?
I get it. So this is something that I've built before, building now, working with it, right? Not necessarily for GitHub, but for insert third-party source code tool. Some of them are better than others. So if you want to look at GitHub Actions, they're really good. GitLab pipelines are less good. It hurts me to say that because they were around for a lot longer and I like them and I liked them a lot more. But GitHub Actions have gone from nothing to a lot better than GitLab pipelines. And then don't even get me started on Bitbucket. They make me want to just jump out of, they want to make me want to defenestrate myself, which for the uninitiated, that means jump out of a window. I want to defenestrate myself because they're just horrible to work with. The upshot of keeping things inside AWS for your builds, even if your code can't live there, the first is cost, actually, weirdly, because if you want to run permanent runners sitting there on servers and things, you have a permanent resource sitting there running. And if you do one build a month, that's probably quite inefficient. And if you're in this open source world, then time is free. So it doesn't really matter how much engineering time it costs to get that to work. And the other one is it drives spend without you having to manage things, because if you want to make sure that all of your spend as much as possible is within one ecosystem, then you don't have to manage servers and patch them and all this kind of malarkey, which I suppose is the point that they make around CodeBuild managed GitHub runners, because CodeBuild can talk out to GitHub Actions runners, and at that point that one does make no sense to me. That makes no sense at all, because CodeBuild can host GitHub runners and then you can use Git. I never understood what that was about.
Yeah, so I think the problem here is it's a difficult sell if you're using GitHub or GitLab, and we're also a huge GitLab fan at our company. Realistically, there's no reason to go this extra step. I'll happily pay the extra cost to not deal with the complexity of crossing ecosystems there. But if you have this idea that you want to run everything in AWS except for your source code, go for it. There's some recommendations in here on how you would do it. But I don't even think it supports the worst ecosystems. If you have Bitbucket or Git or something else that you're storing your source code in, I don't think it supports those Git servers as providers for interaction.
No, you have to use the last bit of a deprecated service. You have to use a CodeStar connection, which CodeStar doesn't exist anymore, but that last little thing still does. So you have to use a CodeStar connection as your source, and then you can do it. So it's an interesting one.
Contrived. I think I might be back after being bandwidth constrained.
Let me fall off my chair.
As I was saying to Warren before we hit the record button, I have got a new fiber connection being installed on Friday. So I guess that means the copper users in the neighborhood are all being throttled to get them to upgrade. That's a conspiracy theory for you. Even though I've already upgraded, I just don't have my upgrade yet. Yeah. Anyway, I think we're done talking about that particular article now. We can move along to the next article for this week, which is an article on CNBC all about the quarterly results announcements last week for all the major focus. And there were a lot, of course, there's always loads of articles in all the various different trade publications. See it again, according to my screen notification. Have I disappeared again?
Yes,
Or am I still there?
Yeah, you're there. We'll muddle through, but you're not going to be able to say anything. So that's fine. This is an interesting podcast.
Because it's been a year since I was on last time, it's actually perfect because last episode, I actually reviewed the same release by CNBC. And I actually went back and I looked and compared what Amazon had released last year for CNBC versus this year. And it's pretty much the same. It went from 9 billion quarterly operating income to 10 billion this year. So it's almost the same. The one thing that Garmin was saying was that we're going to start doing a lot of AI stuff. And they actually did do that, right? They did, quote unquote, do a lot of AI stuff. Obviously, it wasn't like specific on what they would be doing. The one thing that I do want to call out here is the previous year, there was like a 30% growth of revenue for GCP and Azure compared to this year, which is over 30. I think it's almost 40% for both of them compared to the increase for Amazon, which was only 18, 19% for the last 2 years. Now, it's really hard to understand revenue numbers though, because when you're looking at revenue, that's just the money coming in and doesn't account for the spend, the cost to make that happen. And since we don't have a lot of insight into the actual revenue or the total income, the actual cost, it's hard to know if these numbers make sense. We do know that Azure is spending lots of money. Microsoft is spending a ton of money in different areas. Let's say a huge buy into OpenAI. but AWS has bought into Anthropic. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on and whether or not these numbers are super relevant. It looks steady.
Yeah, I struggle with these numbers these big. I'm an engineer. I'm not a finance guy. I might have read the FT once in my life. That's about the size of it. I struggle with numbers this big, and you think well, it's nearly 40% growth for the other players, and it's only 18%, but it's on these ridiculous billions and billions of numbers. So is this a scale problem that we're seeing? And it's one of those, this stat looks worse than that stat, but it's on a higher base number, whatever's going on there.
I think some of them are just being as secretive as possible as to what's going on. I think historically, Microsoft has gotten a lot of flack for merging everything related to a cloud service into Azure and calling it Azure. So it's really, you can't compare these things. And AWS is bogged down by its parent company, basically. It would be great to see AWS split off from Amazon and Azure split off from Microsoft so that we could really understand what's happening in these separate ecosystems, because without that, it's impossible to compare these. And Google has such a huge division where the money is coming in that isn't their cloud. So, what is actually going on there? Are they able to fund their progress, or are they just taking internal revenue from one product and pushing it to another one? So it's hard to actually come to any specific conclusions here.
Because you're not wrong, you're not. It's what does Microsoft include in the cloud earnings these days? I'm sure it includes Office 365.
Yeah.
It's just naughty.
Yep.
That's not cloud. That's just not. And AWS don't really have a comparable product, but
They used to. AWS used to have work docs and work mail. I think work docs.
but nobody used it.
Yeah, but it was included in their revenue. I guess it'd be probably included in their costs more so than not, because I'm sure no one was really spending that much money on those products because they were nowhere near as good as, say, Google Docs or on the Microsoft 365.
Yeah, it was never an apples to apples comparison. It's always hard. It's good to see that they're growing still. It's good to see that I'm likely to have a job for the next year, even if it is going to have to involve AI.
One day you may have to move to Azure or GCP though. But I do have this question. If Azure is really growing by so much year after year, who are these people that are paying for it? Because the one question I really keep having to ask myself is, it wasn't too long ago that Nadella actually committed the company to a security first strategy, holding the executives accountable for more secure solutions there. And then just recently, the SharePoint server vulnerability dropped. And I used to think, okay, yeah, I'm sure people are still running this, but what's the impact? It can't really be that bad. But now we see like lots of people were using the SharePoint database for critical applications that are reaching into government sector as well, which is really shocking for me. So the question comes down to, how many more incidents does a cloud provider need to have before you consider them too insecure and actually switch off of them?
Yeah, I think there's a massive amount of inertia going on there, because I've always thought the whole reason that Microsoft had a decent uptake from users was not because people liked the platform or wanted to use it, but because they were already a verified vendor. And you certainly see this in the enterprise space, where you've done your vendor management piece, you've got to go through this massive rigmarole, and Microsoft as a vendor are already approved, regardless of how good the platform actually is. So you go with them and you just kind of stay with them. And again, they were always, I think, historically quite good about if you got committed spend in one product line, you could move it to another one and just keep giving them your money. And that might account for some of this growth, because even though they're including Office 365, I'm sure license costs and things aren't accounted for, but you could probably move that to an Azure spend. They might let you get away with that. But yeah, I think the problem is inertia, because unless you were directly affected by that, then you probably don't care. The whole SharePoint vulnerability thing, I wasn't aware of that because I don't use it, but I've certainly been in the misfortunate position of having to use it in the past. And I was amazed. Yeah, I am amazed that people are still using the damn thing.
You make a good point that it's likely that customers of the cloud providers are potentially increasing in spend more. And of course, we have to subtract out inflation and the geopolitical macroeconomic climate that is the current world. And that's obviously making some changes there that aren't well reflected in if we just look at the raw numbers. So it's hard to know who are the new customers that are coming on board, for which cloud providers, and how much are they really spending there. I do know that AWS, because we're in the ecosystem, we know that they're definitely going after new customers over and over. And we do know that GCP and Azure are promising credits. I don't remember last time AWS was promising credits to millions, tens of millions of credits for customers to move off of one of the other cloud providers onto AWS. I don't ever remember any of those stories, whereas I see all the time Amazon or Azure and GCP giving away lots of free money for people to migrate off.
Yeah, not seeing that from the AWS space. I'm certainly not seeing that. I'm seeing the migration credits and this, that, and the other. I don't know if you could probably use that to migrate from one to another, but it's certainly not designed as a poaching tactic.
Yeah, I think the only tactic they have is that if you are already planning to migrate to AWS, you can get AWS to pay migration specialists, premier partners of AWS, to do that work for you for free, basically. AWS will pay them to do the work on your behalf. And so you can get pretty far with that in a lot of cases. And it also includes things like training.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It is. It's interesting.
I'm going to
Oh,
try
are
and
you
say
back?
something. No, I may be
You-
back. I don't know. It's hard to know until I start speaking and see whether you guys actually interact with me or not. I did, on the subject of this article, I did see another article in the press today, and that all the major cloud providers are now claiming to be capacity constrained, which is interesting because we've spoken about certain data center contracts being cancelled, but big investments in this country and that country and the other country, etc. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's really a kind of capacity constraint going on?
Interesting. I think if there is, it's AI driven. So AI can go away and we can have all of our capacity back, and I can have some spot instance pricing that makes sense again.
So it's interesting because actually in the last 3 or 4 months, we've had a lot of data center companies, the CPOs, CTOs, et cetera, as well as AI companies on our podcast. And they keep telling us that there's available capacity, that for energy consumption for the data centers and capacity in the data centers to consume. I think depending on the area, we're getting conflicting stories, so much so that we already know some of the cloud providers are going out and trying to build nuclear fission reactors to power future energy reserves. But I think that's to scale up where they currently are. And we know, at least in the United States, the common individual is going to be afflicted by power fluctuations, bad energy reserves. And so there's still more room to take energy out of the grid. It's still available. We haven't got to the bottom yet of actually having to turn your lights off at night, guaranteed after some curfew, et cetera. So I still think there's availability in the world on both of those. I don't think this is bad at. The one capacity thing that is limited is the GPU chips for inference and training. I think those are the two major things that where there is an issue and you could be looking at problems there if you're trying to scale up really big.
I think we certainly had worries about it over the past handful of years in the UK about grid capacity, because it wasn't to the point of the load shedding that you saw in South Africa of a few years ago, which they seem to have sorted out now. It wasn't to that sort of scale. The media love to scaremonger that, because the plan that existed for 20 years from the national grid to say, here's how we do it, and you'd lose power for this amount of time and then that amount of time. And then towards the end of it, you'd only have power for 4 hours a week or something ridiculous. And that plan has existed for 2 decades, but the media found it and went nuts with it around the whole time of the gas imports being shut down and all that malarkey. And we had a little bit, it's voluntary load reduction, if you like. And that was a thing that a number of the energy providers put through for the national grid, and some of them enhanced it. And I made, I don't know, a fiver, I think, by just shifting my load around a little bit, because I've got a battery and I can do that. But yeah, I think the GPUs are probably much more of a constraining factor than power at this point in time.
Let's see. Maybe we'll talk about that article on next week's podcast, because it went into the newsletter.
Maybe
this
we won't
morning.
have power.
But hopefully I will have fiber. But yeah, fiber without power is pretty useless. You can have the fastest internet connection in the world, but if there's nothing to power the router, then yeah, it's not going to be any better than it is today.
Pedal faster, pedal more.
Anyway, on that note, let's move along to our final article for this week. And this is yet another article about this trundling, ongoing Competition and Markets Authority probe in the UK into the major cloud service providers, which now seems to have focused in on just Microsoft and Amazon, much to their disappointment that Google has not been included in this latest finding. But they do seem to, after however many months this has been trundling on for, or years, to have made a finding. And the finding is that both Microsoft and Amazon have significant unilateral market power. SUMP is the acronym, not a very good one, but yeah, Google and Microsoft have this significant unilateral market power. Microsoft and Amazon have this power. Google does not. So I don't know whether they're pleased or disappointed about that. But yeah, it seems that a finding has been made, but no kind of further action has yet been taken. But probably this is more relevant for you, John, because you are in the UK. I'm not sure if Warren is aware that this is going on the other side of the world. But what are your thoughts on this finding?
Oh, the CMA just needs to sod off at this point. This has been going on for so long. I'm bored of it now. I really am. It's and isn't a sump? A sump is a type of pump that you put in things to get the water out of your bilge. It's like a bilge pump. You put it in to get
No, a
water out of your
sump is
boat.
where liquid collects. It's where your oil collects in the bottom of the engine. It's a vessel
And a sump
that
pump
contains.
and a sump pump
Yeah.
gets rid of it out of your sump.
Yes.
This is
Anyway.
British humor here in the regulatory investigation.
Funny word sounds funny. Means other thing. Yeah, so do they have significant unilateral market power? Yeah, obviously. We all know this and we all accept this. Is that a good thing for the market? Maybe not. This is one of the differences, I think, between American capitalism and British capitalism is we like to control our capitalism a little bit more. We're free markets, but only if you behave yourselves. Okay. It's do they
But
have
what I thought was interesting in this article was that in order to be described as having significant unilateral market power, I think it was, that they need to demonstrate that you are gaining disproportionately to the investment that you are making. So the gains that Microsoft and Amazon are getting in the UK cloud market are disproportionate to the capital expenditure that they're making in that market.
doesn't
And
that just mean their marketing's doing the right thing?
I know.
There's always this aspect where you are getting value from your brand recognition, right? And so I feel like that's not really a fair review of the situation, because we all know there's like mere exposure effect bias that affects humans, as well as positive reinforcement through any sort of number of avenues, name recognition, etc. So I think it has to be the case that there's a disproportionate amount. Otherwise, we're saying, yeah, that brand means nothing. And I think throughout this episode, at least, we have said, well, the brand means something, right? So I don't think that finding is that revolutionary.
But I don't think I don't know. I haven't seen the data behind
Yeah.
this decision, but I think it's fair to say that both Microsoft and Amazon and potentially Google are investing enormous amount of capex into the UK cloud market, probably a lot more than the smaller competitors who are the ones who are really bothered by this. Yeah.
This is the difference as well, and this is the issue that I have, and I'm going to ignore the Online Safety Act for the minute because that's a really big political hot potato, and I have things I want to say, but this isn't the forum. This is the issue with the regulator being made of 50-plus-year-old men who have never worked in tech. This is they just don't really understand the ecosystem. They don't understand what's going on. And it's just, that's growing more than it should. And who are these Amazon people? And why do they? And then you look at the other side of things, and government many years ago now, I believe, picked AWS as their cloud provider of choice. So it's government departments. Are you two talking to each other? We know that big companies don't talk to each other within themselves anyway, and the government is probably just as bad. But it's a bit left hand and right hand not knowing what they're doing.
Yeah, it's funny because in Switzerland here, there's less of a concern of the dominance, because a lot of the architecture for large tech, even outside of tech companies, but like in banks and healthcare, is still running on-prem and not in the cloud. And the cloud providers are spending a lot of money and not getting any return in a lot of cases, especially because things move so slowly here.
That's a very Swiss thing to do.
The thing is, waterfall doesn't work. Agile is the only right way forward. However, Swiss planning is so great that it actually will follow the plan. There are like a railroad's going to get changed, or a building is going to get physically moved, and they plan it like 5 years in advance, and then like to the day, everything works out. So unless you have that reliability in your planning strategy, it's just not the same. So it does work here, and that's why the mentality does really still make sense. But it does mean things don't change that much, and it does mean that a huge investment doesn't actually have a huge return as far as investing in marketing campaigns for the cloud. What's really interesting about this article, though, for me, is I find it a little hilarious that UK is like complaining that there's market dominance for these cloud providers, because they created this issue. We can blame regulations, we can blame compliance mandates, GDPR, et cetera, because it's so expensive for, like, comparatively, for smaller companies to comply. Then larger companies just throw some money at it and it's done. Smaller companies, they have to spend real resources in actually making this happen. And it doesn't make anyone more secure. It doesn't actually make the data secure. We see cloud providers and other companies who have gone through all the regulations having tons of vulnerabilities and exposing PII or credit card numbers, et cetera, to the public internet and getting pawned. And really, if they want to fix this problem, all they need to do is say, if you comply with this regulation and get audited, we will give you $1 million or euros or pounds or whatever, because that 1 million euros, pounds, francs, whatever is worthless to Google and Azure and AWS, but it's worth a lot to smaller companies. So they just need to invest in cloud providers being secure and offering the services that everyone wants, and they can make it happen. But instead, of course, they're going to focus on regulations and audit probes into AWS and Azure, where that money is just all throwaway. It's all worthless. They're going to do the probe, and either they're going to find a problem, or because one exists, or they're not going to find one and have to do a further study. But if you take the money and actually invest it in where you want the solution to be, reward, not punishment, we'll actually see the right thing happen.
Yeah, the barrier to entry to standing up a cloud provider is so ridiculously big that the only people that you're aware of that have done it happen to have other massive businesses to fund it for half a dozen years before it starts making its own money. Yeah. And then of the IaaS market, okay, fine. If you're being a bit more specific of the IaaS market, then you start talking about VPS providers as well. But then you're still not really making an apples to apples comparison, because even within the IaaS space, there's a huge number of managed services out there, ALBs and what have you, that are technically infrastructure services, but they're still managed for you. So it's still, if you go and look at a Hetzner or whoever, that's the only VPS provider that comes to mind, or DigitalOcean or Vultr, there you go, there's some others for BBC levels of balance. It's still not a fair comparison. Ovash, yes, the French one.
Yeah.
Were they on fire for a while?
Was it them? Somebody had a data center in Strasbourg or something like that went up in flames. Yeah, can't remember which one it was. But,
I think another part of the problem here is that outside of the hyperscalers, a lot of these cloud providers want to focus only in a single country of residency, like wherever the business is running, and don't have any goal to actually expand outside that country. And so that means you're losing a lot of customers that do want global impact or have their own customers. Let's say us, we can't move to a local cloud provider. I talk to all the local cloud providers in Switzerland, Germany, France, and I'd be like, hey, when are you going to offer solutions, edge nodes, CDNs in every country so that we can have our customers there? And they're like, that's not on our radar. We don't care about that. And so you are operating at a different scale by not being global. And of course, you're going to have a smaller impact. Anyone who worked at a larger company knows about AWS, GCP, or Azure. And that means they're going to be more likely to use that provider when they switch to a different company. But unless you had only local customers, your users are also local, you're not going to know about these local ones or really care about them or think that they actually can solve your needs. And if you actually do look at these other cloud providers, they don't have things like KMS, the key management server from AWS. They don't have things like IAM. They don't have things like, don't use Cognito, but they don't have Cognito. I say don't use Cognito because you should use Authors instead. But realistically, at least there's a Cognito there. And those things don't exist in these other cloud providers. They offer like Kubernetes as a service platform, and that's it. You deploy containers, if you're lucky, maybe. Otherwise, as you said, it's like they're VPS providers, private servers or private systems. That's it. So it makes sense that they're not gaining traction because they're not offering the services of tomorrow, the serverless stuff, whole cloud ecosystems that include all the security stuff, all the early warning signs, all the alerting, all the logging, et cetera, that the hyperscalers actually do.
Absolutely. So do you think there's anything good that could come out of this? Obviously, the one thing that always gets mentioned in these articles is the egress fees being a kind of a point of lock-in. Do you think the UK CMA will force the cloud providers to do something about that? Do you think the UK has enough power to force the cloud providers? And if they do, will it only apply to UK customers, or UK egress fees and the rest of the world will be exactly the same?
Go ahead.
There was a thing that was done about that, I think about a year ago now, where if you raise a support case and say, I am leaving the platform, going somewhere else, they won't charge you the fees. And I don't think anything is going to get any better than that, much as I don't like paying 9 cents per gigabyte egress just to run my service. I don't think that's going to change.
Yeah, AWS came out and basically said, if you're leaving the platform, all your egress is free to make that happen. So I don't know if you can get better than that.
Let's wait and see. Maybe we'll get Warren back on in another 12 months when they might have actually done something about the finding that they've made after a year or so of this probe trundling along. But anyway, on that note, we have reached the end of our time for season 4, episode 31 of Logicast. I think my bandwidth has finally stabilized to the point where I can wrap up the episode. We thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please tell your friends, your colleagues. We are available to download from wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to see me frozen in time, you can check out my terrible stream on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Warren, for joining us again on the anniversary of your previous recording. It's been really great to have you back on the podcast and to hear insights today. And thank you, John, as always, for stepping in and doing my job when bandwidth did not permit me to do it. We will be back again next week with another episode of Logicast for you. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again next time.